My 8-year-old granddaughter rolled her eyes and said, "You can't sit with us. Mom said you're an old burden." The whole table burst out laughing, including my own son. I stood up and left quietly. That night, he texted, "Payment still due tomorrow?" I replied, "Figure it out." The next day, panic. I carefully folded the heavy linen napkin and placed it next to the untouched plate of sea bass that cost $48. The silence at the table ringing in my ears louder than the ambient jazz playing over the speakers of the Gilded Oak. It was my 65th birthday, a milestone I had funded entirely myself, right down to the reservation deposit of $200. My son, Robert, sat to my left, nursing a 20-year-old Scotch. His wife, Elena, was scrolling through her phone, likely checking the engagement metrics on the photo she had just posted of the family dinner, a photo I was barely visible in. But it was my 8-year-old granddaughter, Mia, sitting directly across from me, who had just delivered the sentence that shattered the illusion of my life. She had looked up from her iPad, her eyes innocent and clear, and said, "You can't sit with us next time, Nana. Mom said you're an old burden and we only bring you because you pay." The air left the room. For a second, I waited for the correction. I waited for Robert to gasp, for Elena to scold her, for someone to explain that children say silly things. Instead, Robert let out a short, barking laugh, swirling his drink. Elena didn't look up from her screen, a small, tight smirk playing on her lips as she tapped, like on a comment. They didn't deny it. They didn't apologize. They just accepted the truth of the statement as if Mia had commented on the weather. I looked at my son, the boy I had put through medical school at a cost of $240,000, the man whose practice I had bailed out during the lean years of 2019. He looked back at me, his eyes glazed with a mixture of alcohol and long-standing entitlement, and shrugged. "Kids, right?" he said, dismissing my humiliation with 2 words. That was the moment the membrane of maternal affection finally dissolved, revealing the hard, cold reality underneath. I stood up. My legs felt steady, surprisingly so. "I think I'm going to head home," I said, my voice level. Robert didn't stand up to help me with my coat. "Okay, Mom, we'll order dessert. Don't worry about the bill. We'll put it on your card you left on the file, right?" I looked at him one last time, memorizing the casual cruelty of his expression. "No," I said softly. "I don't think so." I walked to the Maitre d' station, pulled my Amex Platinum card from the file where I had authorized the table, and put it back in my purse. I walked out into the cool November air of downtown Boston, leaving them with a bill that I estimated would come to roughly $600 a sum. They certainly didn't have in their checking accounts, considering I tracked their finances better than they did. The Uber ride back to my condo in the Seaport District was a blur of city lights and internal recalibration. I didn't cry. I was past crying. I was in the assessment phase. I sat in my living room, looking out at the harbor, and waited. The text came at 11:14 p.m. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a "Happy birthday, Mom." It was Robert. Card got declined. Had to use the emergency credit line. Embarrassing. Also, reminder that the mortgage transfer is due tomorrow. First of the month is Tuesday. Don't forget. I stared at the screen. Payment still due. That was it. I was not a mother. I was a payment processor. I was a recurring revenue stream that had developed a glitch. I replied with 3 words, "Figure it out." Then I turned off my phone. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I went into my home office and opened the fireproof safe where I kept the ledgers. I am a retired forensic accountant with 30 years of experience auditing corporate fraud. For the last decade, I had treated my family's finances with a leniency I would never have granted a client. That ended tonight. I opened my laptop and logged into the primary banking portal. It was time for the context phase, the deep dive into the history of the burden. I needed to see exactly how heavy I was. I pulled the transaction history for the last 5 years. The sheer volume of the data was nauseating. It started small, as these things always do. In 2015, Robert and Elena had bought the dream home in Wellesley, a sprawling colonial that cost $1.4 million. They had qualified for the mortgage based on Robert's projected income as a junior partner, but they didn't have the 20% down payment. I gave them $280,000. I called it a gift for tax purposes, but we all knew it was the foundation of their life. Then came the monthly subsidies. Elena wanted to be a stay-at-home content creator, which meant she generated 0 income but incurred significant expenses for lifestyle staging. Robert's practice was growing, but their spending grew faster. The lease on the Range Rover, $1,200 a month. The private school tuition for Mia, $32,000 a year. The country club membership, $800 a month. I looked at the recurring transfers tab on my screen. Every month on the 1st, a transfer of $4,500 was scheduled to go from my trust account to Robert's checking account. The memo line read, "Mortgage assistance, a euphemism for paying it." I had convinced myself for years that this was what grandmothers did. We helped. We ensured stability for the grandchildren. But Mia's voice echoed in the silent room. An old burden. They didn't see the safety net. They saw a shackle. They resented me for the very money they couldn't live without. It is a peculiar psychological phenomenon. The recipient of charity often despises the benefactor because the benefactor's existence is a constant reminder of their own inadequacy. Robert hated me because he needed me. Elena hated me because I controlled the purse strings of the lifestyle she pretended she earned. And they had taught their daughter to view me not as a person, but as an obstacle to their autonomy, an obstacle that paid. I opened the spreadsheet where I tracked my net worth. I was comfortable, very comfortable. My portfolio was valued at just over $8 million, the result of a lifetime of aggressive saving, shrewd investments in municipal bonds, and the sale of my own firm in 2018. I didn't need them. They needed me. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. The transfer was scheduled to execute at 8 a.m. automatically. I moved my cursor to the cancel button. My finger hovered over the mouse. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle of the contract. A social contract relies on reciprocity. I provide funds. You provide respect. You breached the contract. I clicked cancel. A small dialog box popped up. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transaction? I clicked yes. I didn't stop there. I went to the education trust I had set up for Mia. It was a revocable living trust, meaning I retained full control until my death. The balance was $115,000. I had been contributing $2,000 a month since she was born. I navigated to the beneficiary settings. I removed Mia Reynolds. I changed the beneficiary to the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. The change was immediate. The money was still there, but it was no longer theirs. I went deeper. I pulled the credit card statements for the supplementary card I had given Robert for emergencies. I scanned the last 60 days. Emergency purchases included a spa weekend at Canyon Ranch, $2,400, a dinner at Nobu, $850, and a transaction at a luxury boutique called The Velvet Box, $3,200. I clicked on the transaction details for The Velvet Box. Jewelry. He bought jewelry for his wife on my emergency card while I was sitting at home eating leftovers. I felt a cold, metallic anger settle in my chest, replacing the hurt. This was embezzlement. If this were a corporation, I would be calling the authorities. Since it was family, I would simply execute a hostile takeover of their reality. I logged into the credit card portal and reported the card as lost or stolen. I requested a new card with a new number to be mailed to my address, and I explicitly removed Robert as an authorized user. His card would be dead by morning. The next step was the car, the Range Rover. I had co-signed the lease in 2021 because their debt-to-income ratio was too high. Because I was a co-signer, I had access to the leasing account. I logged in. They were 2 months behind on payments, and I hadn't been notified because the notices were going to their address. I paid the arrears $3,600 to bring the account current. Why? Because I didn't want my credit score ruined. But then I looked at the lease terms. There was a clause for early termination by lessee. It would cost a penalty, but it would sever the tie. I didn't terminate it yet. I needed that as leverage. I printed every statement. I printed the text message Robert had sent. I printed the photo Elena had posted on Instagram, the one with the caption, "Family first number blessed," taken 20 minutes before they let their daughter call me a burden. I created a physical file, a dossier of ingratitude. By the time the sun began to rise over the harbor, painting the water in shades of gray and steel, I had dismantled the entire financial scaffolding of Robert's life. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, sipping cold coffee. I felt a strange sense of peace. It was the peace of the auditor who has finally balanced the books. At 8:15 a.m., my phone began to buzz. It was Robert. I let it go to voicemail. 8:17 a.m., Robert again. Voicemail. 8:20 a.m., Elena calling. Voicemail. 8:22 a.m., a text from Robert. Mom, the bank just sent a notification. The transfer didn't go through. Is there an issue with the trust? Please call me as soon as possible. The mortgage is drafted today. I watched the notifications stack up on the lock screen. The panic was setting in. They lived on a razor's edge of liquidity. They relied on that transfer hitting at 8 a.m. to cover the mortgage payment that was auto-drafted at 9 a.m. Without my deposit, their account would overdraw. The dominoes were starting to fall. I stood up and walked to the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. I had a busy day ahead. I needed to call my estate attorney, Jonathan, and schedule an emergency meeting to revise my will. I needed to call a locksmith to change the codes on my condo, just in case they still had the emergency entry code. And I needed to prepare for the confrontation, because they would come. They wouldn't call, they would come. Narcissists never believe they have been cut off. They believe there has been a mistake. They believe the world owes them their sustenance. I took a shower, washing off the residue of the previous night's restaurant, the scent of expensive perfume and betrayal. I dressed in a sharp navy blazer and tailored trousers. I put on my pearl earrings. I looked in the mirror. I didn't look like an old burden. I looked like a CEO. I looked like a woman who was about to conduct a performance review for an underperforming employee. At 9:30 a.m., the buzzing of the phone stopped and the pounding on my front door began. I checked the security camera feed on my iPad. It was Robert. He was wearing scrubs, presumably to look like he had come from work to garner sympathy. He looked frantic. He was pressing the doorbell repeatedly. I walked to the door, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened it. Robert stood there, his face flushed, his phone in his hand. Mom, Jesus, why aren't you answering? He practically shouted, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. The transfer failed. The mortgage bounced. I have overdraft fees hitting my account right now. You need to call the bank. It's a mess. He was pacing, his agitation filling the small space. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention the dinner. He was entirely focused on the disruption of his supply chain. I closed the door quietly and leaned against it, crossing my arms. It wasn't a mistake, Robert, I said. My voice was calm, projecting perfectly in the acoustic hallway. He stopped pacing and turned to look at me, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. What? The transfer, I clarified. It didn't fail. I canceled it. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. Robert stared at me, his mouth slightly open. You canceled it? Why? Mom, you know that money covers the house. You can't just cancel it. We have a routine. We had a routine. I corrected him. The routine was that I pay for your life, and you pretend to respect me. That routine ended last night when you laughed at your daughter calling me a burden. Robert rolled his eyes, a gesture so similar to his daughter's it made my stomach turn. Oh my God, are you seriously doing this because of what Mia said? She's 8, Mom. She repeats stuff she hears on TV. You're going to bankrupt us over a tantrum? She didn't hear it on TV, Robert, I said, walking past him into the living room, forcing him to follow me. She said, Mom said you're an old burden. She was quoting your wife, and you laughed. You confirmed it. I was drinking, he protested, his voice rising. I didn't mean anything by it. Elena was just venting. You know how stressed she is. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry your feelings were hurt, but you can't punish us like this. It's financial abuse. Financial abuse, I repeated, tasting the irony of the phrase. That is a very interesting term, Robert. Let's talk about abuse. Let's talk about the emergency credit card you used to buy diamond earrings for Elena at the Velvet Box on October 14th. Was that a medical emergency? Or was that you stealing $3,000 from your mother? Robert went pale. The color drained from his face as if I had pulled a plug. I intended to pay that back, he stammered. I was waiting for my bonus. You haven't had a bonus in 2 years, I said, consulting the mental ledger. I know your practice is financials, Robert. I know you're barely breaking even because you refuse to take on more insurance patients. I know everything. I picked up the file from the coffee table, the physical evidence I had compiled in the early hours of the morning. This is the context, Robert. This is the reality of your existence. You are 42 years old. You live in a house you cannot afford, drive a car you do not own, and send your daughter to a school you do not pay for. You are a pauper in a prince's costume, and I am the seamstress who has been stitching it together for a decade. Mom, please, he said, his tone shifting from aggression to begging. We can't pay the mortgage without that transfer. If we miss it, the rate lock expires. We could lose the house. Then perhaps you should sell it, I suggested coldly. I hear the market is quite good. Maybe you can find something more to commensurate with your actual income. Perhaps a nice condo in Revere? He looked at me with horror. Revere was a working-class suburb. To him, it was exile. You're enjoying this, he whispered. You're actually sick. You want to see us fail. I don't want to see you fail, I said, sitting down in my armchair. I want to see you stand, but you can't stand when you're being carried, so I am putting you down. The transfer is canceled permanently. The credit card is canceled. The education trust is revoked. Revoked? He stepped forward. You can't revoke Mia's trust. That's for her future. It was, I agreed. Now it's for the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. They treat children who are actually burdens of disease, burdens of tragedy, and yet they fight with more grace than your daughter has shown in her entire privileged life. If you want Mia to go to college, Robert, you will have to start a savings account, like a normal parent. Robert stood there, shaking. The panic was turning into rage, the impotent rage of the entitled. You're a bitter old woman, he spat out. Elena was right. You are a burden, and you're going to die alone. I might die alone, I said, unflinching, but I will die solvent, and I will die with my dignity. Can you say the same? I'm leaving, he said, turning on his heel, and don't expect to see Mia. You're done. You're cut off. No access to the grandkids, nothing. That, I said to his retreating back, is a price I am willing to pay. Leave your key on the table. He didn't leave the key. He slammed the door so hard, the framed photos on the wall rattled. I looked at the closed door. Phase 1 was complete. The crisis had occurred. The context had been established. Now came the slow burn of the discovery, where he would go home to his wife and realize that the tap wasn't just turned off. The plumbing had been ripped out of the walls. I picked up my phone. I dialed Jonathan, my attorney. Jonathan, I said when he answered, I need to make some changes to the estate, and I need you to draft a demand letter for the repayment of a personal loan. The $3,200 for the jewelry. I want it formally documented. I wasn't done. I was just getting started. The silence that settled over my condo after Robert slammed the door was not the heavy, suffocating silence of loneliness. It was the crisp, sterile silence of a crime scene after the bodies have been removed. I stood in the foyer for exactly 2 minutes, regulating my breathing, before walking to the kitchen island where I kept my master ledger. The confrontation with Robert had been the emotional catalyst, but in my profession, emotion is merely a variable that must be isolated to prevent it from corrupting the data. I picked up my phone and dialed Jonathan, my estate attorney. He answered on the second ring, his voice gravelly and professional. Jonathan, I said, I need to execute the codicil we discussed hypothetically last year, and I need to open a new file. We are treating this as a hostile division divestiture of a non-performing subsidiary. Jonathan didn't ask questions. He knew Robert understood. What are the immediate liabilities? There is a co-signed lease on a 2023 Range Rover Sport. I recited, picturing the document in my mind. There is a demand letter needed for $3,200 in misappropriated funds regarding the Velvet Box transaction, and I need a formal cease and desist drafted regarding authorized user access on all accounts, just to be thorough. We spent the next hour mapping out the legal battlefield. I approached the dismantling of my son's life with the same forensic precision I had once used to take down corrupt CFOs. This was the discovery phase, and it required absolute attention to detail. Over the next 3 weeks, I did not leave my apartment except for groceries and Pilates. I became a ghost in my own life, monitoring the fallout through digital periscopes. I set up Google alerts for Robert Reynolds MD and Elena Reynolds lifestyle. I monitored the local court dockets for civil filings. The first crack appeared on November 12th. I received a notification from the leasing company for the Range Rover. The payment was 10 days late. Robert had missed the grace period. I logged into the portal and saw the late fee, $150. I didn't pay it. Not yet. I wanted the delinquency to register on his credit report. I wanted the algorithm to flag him as high risk. On November 15th, the smear campaign began. I knew it would. Narcissists, when denied their supply, do not reflect. They project. My sister Judith called me at 7:30 p.m. Judith is a kind woman, but she possesses a fatal flaw. She believes family is a sacred covenant that supersedes logic. Margaret, she said, her voice dripping with that specific, patronizing concern people reserve for the elderly and the infirm. I had coffee with Elena today. She's very worried about you. Is she? I asked, putting my phone on speaker so I could continue highlighting lines on the credit card statement I had printed out. She says you've been acting erratically, Judith continued, lowering her voice. She mentioned you made a scene at your birthday dinner, that you walked out and left them with the bill, and that you've cut off the grandchildren's school payments. Margaret, she thinks. Robert thinks you might be having episodes. Early onset confusion. They're worried you're not managing your finances correctly and that you're paranoid. I stopped highlighting. The pen hovered over a charge for Sephora, $412.50. It was a masterful pivot. By painting me as incompetent, they not only delegitimized my anger, but laid the groundwork to challenge my autonomy legally. If I was confused, then my revocation of the trust was invalid. If I was paranoid, then my accusations of financial abuse were delusions. Did she mention why I walked out? I asked calmly. She said you were upset about a joke Mia made. Something about not sitting with you? Margaret, kids are silly. To cut off your son over a child's comment seems extreme. That's why they're worried. It's a disproportionate response. It suggests cognitive decline. I see, I said. And did Robert mention the $3,200 he stole from me to buy Elena diamond earrings last month? Stole? Judith gasped. Margaret, see, this is what they mean. You're using words like stole. Robert is a doctor. He doesn't need to steal. Judith, I said, my voice dropping to the register I used when testifying in federal court. I am going to ask you to do something. I want you to arrange a meeting. You, me, Robert, and Elena. Next Thursday, Thanksgiving. Instead of the big dinner, tell them to come here. Tell them I'm willing to listen to their concerns about my health. Tell them I want to clear the air. Oh, Margaret, that's wonderful. Judith exhaled, relieved. I knew you'd come around. I'll set it up. We can fix this. Yes, I said, looking at the stack of evidence folders on my desk, each labeled with a blue sticky note. We will fix this definitively. The week leading up to Thanksgiving was a study in rhythmic acceleration. I prepared the room. I moved the dining table to the center of the living area. I set up 4 chairs. I didn't cook a turkey. I didn't buy a pie. This wasn't a holiday. It was a deposition. On Tuesday, the Range Rover payment became 30 days late. The leasing agent called me. Miss Reynolds, as the co-signer, you are liable for the outstanding balance of $1,350 plus late fees. I will pay it, I told the agent, on one condition. I want a certified letter stating that the primary lessee, Robert Reynolds, is in default and that I have cured the default. And I want to know the procedure for assuming possession of the vehicle. The agent explained that since my name was on the title as a co-lessee, I had equal rights to the vehicle. If I paid the arrears, I was entitled to the keys. I paid the bill. I printed the receipt. Exhibit C. Thursday arrived with a gray, biting wind. At 1 p.m. the buzzer rang. I buzzed them up. Judith arrived first, carrying a pumpkin pie, her face a mask of hopeful anxiety. Robert and Elena followed. They looked tired, but smug. They walked in with the confidence of people who believe they have won. They thought I had capitulated. They thought the dementia narrative had scared me back into submission. Robert gave me a stiff hug. Hi, Mom. Glad we're doing this. We just want what's best for you. Elena didn't hug me. She looked around the apartment, likely assessing what could be sold when they put me in a home. Where's the food? She asked, glancing at the empty kitchen counters. We aren't eating yet, I said. Please, sit down. I gestured to the 4 chairs arranged in a semicircle facing my large television screen. They sat. Judith took the chair in the middle, acting as the buffer. Robert and Elena sat together, a united front of concern. I stood before them, holding a remote control. Judith tells me you are worried about my cognitive faculties, I began, my tone conversational. She tells me you believe I am paranoid and making irrational financial decisions. Mom, we love you, Robert said, leaning forward, using his bedside manner voice. But you stranded us at a restaurant. You cut off Mia's school. You're accusing me of theft. These aren't the actions of the mother I know. We think you need a neurological evaluation, just to be safe. And until then, we think it might be best if I helped manage the accounts, just so you don't accidentally hurt yourself financially. There it was, the power grab. He wanted power of attorney. Elena nodded solemnly. It's for your own protection, Margaret. You're clearly confused about money. Confused, I repeated. Let's test that hypothesis. I pressed the button on the remote. I had connected my laptop to the TV. The screen flared to life, displaying a high-resolution image of a credit card statement. Exhibit A, I said. October 14th, 2:14 p.m. The velvet box. $3,214.50. I pointed to the screen. Robert, can you tell the room what this purchase was? Robert froze. He looked at Judith, then at the screen. I don't remember every charge, Mom. That's petty. It was a pair of diamond drop earrings, I said. Elena is wearing them right now. I looked at Elena. She instinctively reached up to touch her earlobe, then dropped her hand, her face flushing crimson. I used the emergency card because I left my wallet at home. Robert lied, the sweat starting to bead on his forehead. It was an accident. I meant to transfer the money. An accident, I said. Interesting. Because on October 15th, the next day, you sent me a text saying, business is slow, might need help with the mortgage. You didn't mention the diamonds. Is that confusion, Robert? Or is that fraud? I didn't wait for an answer. I clicked the remote. The screen changed. It was a screenshot of a text message thread between Elena and her friend, Sarah. I had acquired this through a shared iCloud photo album Elena had foolishly synced with an old iPad she gave me 2 years ago, an iPad she forgot was still logged in. The text read, the old hag finally walked out. Hopefully she croaks soon so we get the trust. Need that inheritance to cover the Amex. A gasp from Judith. She put her hand over her mouth, staring at Elena. Elena turned white. That's private. You hacked my phone. I didn't hack anything, I said coldly. You synced your photos to my device. You are sloppy, Elena. You are malicious, and you are sloppy. This is insane. Robert stood up. You're invading our privacy. We're leaving. Sit down, I commanded. The voice wasn't loud, but it was reinforced by 30 years of boardroom authority. You are leaving when I tell you to leave. We are discussing my competence. Let's look at yours. Click. Exhibit C. The letter from the leasing company. This is a notice of default on the Range Rover, I said. You haven't paid the lease in 60 days. I paid it yesterday. $1,350. Legally, because I cured the default, I have asserted my rights as a lessee. I pulled a set of keys from my pocket. I had a locksmith meet me at your house an hour ago while you were driving here in Judith's car. I have repossessed the vehicle. It is currently parked in my garage downstairs. You stole my car? Robert shouted, his face turning a violent shade of purple. It's not your car, I said. It's the bank's car. And since I am the only one paying the bank, it is my car. You can walk home. Or perhaps Judith can give you a ride. Judith was weeping now. Soft, horrified sobs. She looked at Robert, her eyes wide with betrayal. Robert, is it true? Did you buy diamonds with her money? Did you say those things? She's twisting it, Aunt Judith, Robert yelled, pointing at me. She's crazy. Look at this. She planned this whole ambush. Who does this? A forensic accountant does this, I said. A mother who has been bled dry for a decade does this. I advanced on them, dropping the remote on the table. You came here to declare me incompetent so you could seize my assets. You wanted to verify that the old burden was losing her mind so you could take control. But the only thing I have lost, Robert, is my patience. I looked at Elena, who was refusing to meet my eyes. The jewelry demand letter was sent to your attorney this morning. If the $3,200 is not returned within 7 days, I will file a police report for credit card fraud. And Robert, since you are a medical professional, a fraud charge will trigger an automatic review by the state medical board. You could lose your license. The room was absolutely silent. The jazz music from the restaurant flashback seemed to play in my mind, but this time, the silence wasn't humiliating. It was heavy with the weight of truth. Robert slumped back in his chair, defeated. The arrogance was gone. The doctor was gone. He was just a boy who had been caught with his hand in the jar, except the jar was worth millions, and the hand was holding a subpoena. What do you want? He whispered. I want you to admit it, I said, in front of Judith. Admit that I am not confused. Admit that you are a leech. Admit that you taught your daughter to disrespect me because you resent needing me. Robert looked at the floor. He breathed raggedly. You're not confused, he muttered. Louder, I said. You're not confused, he shouted, tears of frustration springing to his eyes. I needed the money, okay? The practice is underwater. The house is too expensive. We're drowning. I needed you to keep paying. And the burden comment? I asked. He looked at Elena. Elena said it. I laughed because it was easier than defending you. I'm sorry. I looked at Judith. You are the witness, I said. You have heard the testimony. I walked to the door and opened it. The intervention is over. You may go. Judith, you are welcome to stay for pie. Robert, Elena, get out. They stood up, shaky and pale. They walked past me, stripped of their narrative, stripped of their car, stripped of their dignity. Elena didn't look at me. Robert paused for a second, looking like he wanted to say something, perhaps to beg, but he saw the wall of ice in my eyes and thought better of it. They left. I closed the door. I locked the deadbolt. I turned to Judith, who was wiping her eyes with a napkin. Now, I said, picking up the pumpkin pie she had brought, shall we have some coffee? The climax was over. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a hollow ache in my bones, but the trembling in my my hands had stopped. I was not a burden. I was the architect of my own vindication. But the work wasn't quite done. There was still the matter of the house in Wellesley, and the inevitable bankruptcy that was coming for them. The aftermath would be messy, and I intended to document every single penny of it. The check for $3,200 arrived via certified mail on the following Tuesday. It was a cashier's check, meaning Robert had physically gone to a bank branch and withdrawn the funds against what I assumed was a severely depleted checking account. He had chosen to save his medical license rather than his pride. I deposited it immediately. I did not send a thank you note. In the world of forensic accounting, one does not thank a subject for restitution. One simply notes the entry in the recovered assets column. The aftermath was not a singular event, but a slow, grinding erosion of the facade Robert and Elena had spent a decade constructing. Deprived of the monthly mortgage assistance subsidy and facing the sudden removal of the emergency credit line, their financial ecosystem collapsed with predictable velocity. On December 2nd, the inevitable occurred. I received a notification from Zillow. The Wellesley house was listed for sale. The asking price was $1.5 million, optimistic, considering the market had cooled and they had done zero maintenance since moving in. I watched the listing like a hawk. I saw the photos rooms staged to look minimalist, likely because they had started selling furniture to generate cash flow. 2 weeks later, the price dropped to $1.4 million. 3 weeks after that, $1.35 million. It sat. The dream home was becoming an albatross. I learned through Judith, who had become my unwilling but dutiful informant, that the mood in the Reynolds household was apocalyptic. Elena had attempted to launch a minimalist living course on her social media channels to monetize their downsizing, but the internet is a ruthless auditor. Commenters noticed the missing Range Rover. They noticed the lack of unboxing videos. Her engagement plummeted, and with it, her delusions of being a digital entrepreneur. In January, Robert filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. I knew this because I was listed as a creditor for the remaining balance of the Range Rover lease break fee, which I had paid to preserve my own credit score, but had legally assigned to him as a debt. I attended the meeting of creditors, the 341 hearing. I didn't have to go. My attorney advised against it, saying it was gilding the lily, but I went. I sat in the back of the generic government conference room, wearing a nondescript wool coat and a hat pulled low. I watched my son, the doctor, sit before the bankruptcy trustee and explain under oath how a household income of $300,000 had evaporated. He had to detail the leases, the country club dues, the tuition, the vacations. He had to admit, on public record, that he was insolvent. When the trustee asked about the large monthly transfers from a family trust that had ceased in November, Robert hesitated. He looked down at his hands. That was familial support. It has been withdrawn. And without that support, the debtor is unable to meet current obligations? The trustee asked, typing efficiently. Yes, Robert whispered. I left before he saw me. I didn't need him to see me. The validation was in the transcript. They lost the house. It didn't sell in time to beat the foreclosure clock, so they did a short sale, walking away with zero equity and a bruised credit score that would haunt them for 7 years. They moved to an apartment complex in Malden. It was a perfectly adequate 2-bedroom unit in a brick building near the T-station. It was the kind of place honest, working people lived. For Robert and Elena, it was a gulag. The most difficult part of the aftermath was Mia. I am not made of stone. Cutting off the tuition meant she was pulled from her private academy mid-year. Judith told me there were tears, that Mia didn't understand why she had to go to public school, why she couldn't take writing lessons anymore. It pained me, but I held the line. To intervene would be to validate the very entitlement that had poisoned her. She needed to learn that education is a privilege, not a birthright, and that her parents' failure to plan was not her grandmother's emergency to solve. I sent a letter to the St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, enclosing a check for the full balance of the revoked education trust. In return, I received a photo of a piece of equipment my donation had purchased, a specialized centrifuge for pediatric cancer research. I taped it to my refrigerator. It was a reminder that my burden was lifting actual burdens from families who truly suffered. The silence from Robert and Elena lasted for 14 months. No birthday calls, no Mother's Day cards, just the silence of people who have realized that their love bombing no longer yields currency. Then, the resolution began to take shape. 3 years have passed since that dinner at the Gilded Oak. I am 68 now. My life is quiet, ordered, and abundantly solvent. I still live in my condo in the seaport. I still wake up at 6 a.m. without an alarm. But the tension that used to live in my shoulders, the constant, low-level anxiety about whether Robert would call with a new crisis, is gone. I have traveled. I took a river cruise down the Danube, a trip I had postponed for 5 years because I was saving for the grandkids. I met a lovely retired architect named David on the boat. We have dinner once a week. He knows about my son. I told him the story on our third date as a litmus test. He didn't call me cruel. He poured me more wine and said, "It sounds like you finally retired from the hardest job in the world." I see Robert and Elena occasionally. We have reached a state of détente, a cold peace mediated by clear boundaries. We meet for lunch twice a year, always at a mid-range chain restaurant, always separate checks. Robert looks older. The gray at his temples is real now, not distinguished. He is still a doctor, but he works as a salaried physician at an urgent care center. The dream of the high-end private practice died with the bankruptcy. He clocks in, he stitches up cuts, he treats treats flu symptoms, and he clocks out. He drives a 5-year-old Honda. He wears a watch he bought at Macy's. He is, for the first time in his life, an adult. At our last lunch, about 2 months ago, Elena brought Mia. She is 11 now. She wore jeans and a hoodie, not the designer outfits she used to parade in. She was quiet, sullen in the way preteens are, poking at her pasta. Halfway through the meal, Mia looked up at me. "Nana," she said, "Dad says you used to be rich." The table went quiet. Robert froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Elena looked out the window. I dabbed my mouth with my napkin. "I am comfortable, Mia," I said, "because I worked very hard and I didn't spend money I didn't have." "Can I have a new iPhone?" she asked. "All the kids have the Pro." Robert put his fork down. "Mia," he said, his voice sharp, "don't ask your grandmother for things. We discuss our budget at home. If it's not in the budget, we don't get it." I looked at my son. It was a small thing, a microscopic shift, but it was there. He hadn't looked at me to rescue him. He hadn't laughed. He had parented. He had accepted the constraint. "Your father is right," I said to Mia. But I reached into my purse. "I did bring you something." I handed her a book. It was a copy of The Richest Man in Babylon, a classic parable about thrift and financial wisdom. Inside the cover, I had tucked a $50 bill. "This is for the book," I said. "Read it. If you write me a 2-page report on what you learned, I will give you another $50. That is the offer. It is non-negotiable." Mia looked at the book, then at the money. She rolled her eyes, but she took it. "Thanks," she muttered. "You're welcome," I said. When the check came, Robert reached for it. "I've got mine," I said, reaching for my purse. "No, Mom," Robert said. He didn't look me in the eye, but his hand was steady on the bill. "I invited you. I'll get it. It's in the budget." I hesitated. I looked at the cheap laminated menu, the rainy parking lot outside, the weary lines on my son's face. He wasn't the prince anymore. He was just a man trying to make the math work. "Thank you, Robert," I said. I watched him pay. He used a debit card. I drove home alone, listening to a podcast on market trends. When I walked into my apartment, the silence greeted me like an old friend. I walked to the window and looked out at the harbor. The water was choppy, the boats bobbing in the gray swell. I thought about the word burden. I thought about the weight I had carried and the weight I had dropped. I had lost the fantasy of the perfect family. Yes, I had lost the adoration that comes with being a human ATM, but I had gained something far more valuable. I had given my son the dignity of his own consequences. I went to my desk and opened my ledger. I recorded the cost of the book, $14.95. The cash gift, $50. I looked at the final column, zero liabilities. I closed the book. The audit was complete.